And then always getting home, or getting home is always the very best part. See lots of different things, but landing back in the United States can't be beat. You get off the airplane, go through customs, and you get to go home. And I'm very fortunate that I'm an American woman, because in many countries I would never have had the opportunity to do this. Oh, there I am. Thank you.
Right. Well, I've got to say that working with the people who designed and built the 747, and some of you are in the audience, it's always given me the confidence that if I fly a Boeing plane, it's the safest, best built airplane in the world. And I always insist on flying on Boeing airplanes. And now, meeting people who operate and fly the planes, I'm even more confident. And so I think it shows you that the reason that air travel is the safest form of travel is that there really are some of the most confident, professional, and some of the most intelligent people in the world building and operating these airplanes. So, thank you very much. All right. We're not done yet. We'll have time for some questions.
Folks, if you have a question, if you show your hand, we'll bring the mic to you, and if you just wait till the mic gets to you so everybody can hear the question.
We'll have Mike bring the mic.
And
Paul.
And Paul.
Our first question is back here, Mike.
This is for Mr. Ladder. So I've always heard that turbofan engines are more efficient at altitude than they are in the lower altitudes. If that's true, could you explain why?
Sure, at least I'll try. The way in which an engine operates can be described really by what are called non-dimensional parameters. And that means that quite literally you can define a point where an engine will operate at sea level, and you can find an equivalent of it somewhere else in the flight envelope. And the engine will operate pretty well as that it dictates. In the case of a piston engine, the airflow that or the power that comes out of the engine is a function of the airflow that goes through the engine and the pressure at which it goes through. Really, it's the amount of airflow that goes through the engine. And that is a mass flow situation. Now, as you go to altitude, obviously density drops off, airflow drops off, power drops off. And as you do that, you can, in some ways, you can recover some of that by supercharging the engine. And you're supercharging the front end, and it makes it more efficient then to go to a given altitude. But above that so-called full throttle altitude, you're suffering the same kind of problem. You're completely at the mercy of the density of the air that's going up there. The combustion process as you go to altitude in a piston engine is not as efficient. On a gas turbine, it's slightly different there in that you are capable of operating the engine at, first of all, it's a function of the airflow that's going through it, and the energy that you're putting in there, you're capable of, particularly at high speed, you're capable of burning fuel in that thing, and the efficiency of the compressor and the efficiency of the turbine does not suffer in the same way that the efficiency of the cycle suffers in a piston engine. So it's basically what's called the thermal efficiency of the engine that improves as you go to altitude with a gas turbine. It doesn't improve as you go to altitude with a piston engine, while you can recover some of it, like I said, with a supercharger. But in general, a gas turbine will get more fuel efficient as you go to altitude because of two things. One is the thermal efficiency improvement as you get up there, and the second one is the propulsive efficiency, which is a function of whether you're moving a high amount of air slowly or a high mass flow of air slowly, and vice versa. You're burning In a gas turbine engine, you're burning fuel at constant pressure. In a piston engine, you're burning it essentially at constant volume. And that difference is the thing that really makes the difference in the efficiency of the engine. It's not easy to explain, as you can see, in real easy terms. You've almost got to sit down and work out some numbers so you can see how mass flow, density, and pressure varies as you go to altitude with the airplane. So that's not a very efficient answer, but hopefully it points you in the right direction anyway. Yeah.
On the early 747s, you had inlet doors, and of course, we don't see them anymore. What has changed? Is it the bypass ratio?
Very.
Okay. One of the things you try to do when you design an airplane is to, if you design the airplane for sea level maximum thrust, and you move in something like with a JT90, you move in something like 1,400 pounds a second through that inlet. If you design it so that it operates at full throttle, in other words, maximum airflow through the inlet, static on the ground, you will end up with a very fat-lipped inlet because you want to keep the air attached as it's being sucked into the inlet. So when you design a real inlet, you actually compromise that. You make it sharper than it should be, and you compromise it. And what you do is to try to make that thing optimum for altitude so that you're not spilling air and you're not separating air going into the engine. And in order to, one of the things you can do to help that is what are called blowing doors. And what that essentially does is to increase the size of the inlet artificially, statically, or very on the ground, if you like, when you go to high power. What you find, and what we found with the blowing doors on the 747, was that they produced the airflow that you needed, but the disturbance in pressure that you got downstream of those blowing doors inside the inlet into the fan face could affect the pressure distortion going into the core engine, and that could cause surges. And that was one of the reasons that we got rid of it. You'll notice the same kind of thing on the Harrier that sits at the end of the museum here. Same kind of idea there, because that was one that had to hover. So it had to use full throttle at 0 speed. We don't have to do that with a high-powered jet like the 747. We use, and these guys can talk to it better than I can, but we use a technique called rolling takeoff. And you'll see it most times that you see airplanes going out from here, any airport for that matter. You'll hear the guys stand the throttle up and get the airplane rolling, and they'll get to about 40 knots, and then they'll really put the power to it up to the flight manual level of performance that you need. That is recognition of the fact that if you try and statically push that thing up to the firewall, you will actually you can separate the inlet and cause distress to the engine that way. If you look in wet weather at a 737, you can often see a vortex that's underneath that's being sucked into that inlet. That's an indication of how much influence there is outside of that inlet, pulling that air into it. And if you've got a sharp lip, it's going to pull it in, and you're going to get separation, and that may affect the engine performance and stability. So that's the reason. And the reason we got rid of it was because of the downstream effects inside the engine on the 9D. Okay? That's a question.
Mike over here.
This question is for the two gentlemen that are in the cockpit nursing those 4 Pratt & Whitney engines. When they're very sensitive and very demanding, how much of the wrestling with them is the pilot and how much is the flight engineer? Or are you constantly working together to try to herd these 4 cats to do what you want them to do?
Usually on descent, it would be one of the pilots making the descent. Either the pilot, the captain, or the co-pilot. And as you, on the sensitive engines, as you pull the power back, then it's actually we have a procedure where we're supposed to fly the airplane and do not hurry. But in the case of these engines, when they start to overtemp, you have to really get them off. So get them turned off immediately. So generally, what happens is there goes number 1. And whoever gets to the cutoff lever first cuts that engine off before it overtemps. Because if it overtemps, you can have an engine fire, and we don't want that happening. So that's one of the problems with this with the engines when they were the early engines. In fact, you had to throw out some of your procedures to fly the airplane. Do not hurry. In this case, you had to get those things off.
Next question is here, Mike.
This is a general question about the crewing of the 747. In her book, Flying Tigers, the lady that flew 747s for Flying Tiger Airline seemed to say that the flight engineer was also a qualified pilot, that they would take turns being the flight engineer. Is this an unusual crewing situation, or why would they do that?
John, you want to take that one?
I don't really know much about that particular problem. We didn't have it in Pan Am. We did have, the flight engineer actually had a commercial instrument rating. Frankly, the reason he did mainly was because when the jets came on, the pilots could see that there was going to be an enormous layoff of pilots because of the larger airplane carrying more people. So they insisted that the third guy in the cockpit be a pilot. So the flight engineer union went to that and says, okay, then train us as pilots. And so we got commercial instrument rating, but as one of my friends said, I'm a pilot, not a pilot. And so normally, if you're going to get into some other company that handled it differently, I just don't know how to handle it. We never did takeoff and landings or anything like that as pilots. We're even operating in the pilot positions.
On Northwest, when I started, all three positions were, except for on the case of Lockheed Electra, we had full-time flight engineers on the Lockheed Electra. On the 727 and all the jets, everybody started out as a second officer, which is the flight engineer position, and you were a pilot qualified. However, you were not qualified to take off and land the airplane until you went through a co-pilot checkout.
General question for anybody or all of you. Favorite 747 moment?
Well, who wants to go first? Go ahead.
One of my early flights on the 747-400, and I hadn't been flying it very long, and this kind of goes back to what Jim was saying. I had to do a missed approach in Manila in the Philippines, and it doesn't happen all the time out on the line, or very seldom. You know, you get to your routine, you do it in training. So this happened, and the co-pilot and I, it's only two crews going down there, are going through all the procedures, and we get it all done, and we do it right. And to me, it was the big eye-opening moment of this great big jet that, as Jim said, is just kind of lumbering along. It's a big lumox. When you ask it to do something, it does it. It jumps right to, it just changes its personality, and it flies like any small jet. So that was one of my favorite things about this airplane, to come to the realization that it's big, but it does what you want.
I would say, in my case, the most fun for me, I enjoyed the Hong Kong landing, but it's taking off from New York for Tokyo, and there you can't put another toothpick on the airplane. I mean, it's absolute total max gross weight, and you roar, those engines start roaring, and the hair on the back of your head, the back of your neck kind of sticks up, and you roll down that runway, and that is a real thrill when you hear those engines roar, and you know you're right at max gross weight. Very fun, very enjoyable.
Let me maybe add one here. One of the more interesting efforts that I had on was involvement with the 747 E4, so-called. That's the National Command Post airplane. And it's a 747 that was designed in the mid-70s for operation by the president and whoever he cares to take with him if there's ever a national emergency. And that airplane's capable of flying for 3 days. And that was quite a design exercise. But we had a lot of electrical power on there, obviously, because that airplane had a lot of electronic equipment on it, as would be required for operating the country for 3 days from the air. And the E-4 was flight tested here as a basic 747, and then it was sent down to E-Systems in Texas to have all of the stuff, all of the secret stuff stuffed in it. And on the second of the flight test programs, our project pilot on from the Air Force, from Edwards Air Force Base, was a fellow called Dick Scobie, who most of us know as the commander of the Challenger that crashed in 1986. And Dick at that time was, earlier on in the mid-70s, he was a major at Edwards. And he came up here to evaluate the airplane. And we were trying to evaluate the airplane with a lot of generators. We had, I think, 1,200 kVA on each engine. So we had a lot of electrical power and a lot of very heavy integrated drive generators on that airplane. And we had immersion heaters in the fuel tanks. And so when you were trying to do performance activity on that airplane, you had to set up whatever electrical load you needed by powering the immersion heaters in the fuel tanks. And then you had to wait about 20 minutes at high altitude in order for the temperatures to settle down before you could do any performance flying. And the airplane was empty, as I said, and okay, we got the conditions set up, and I went downstairs to get a cup of coffee. We basically, on the side of the airplane, totally empty, had a little wooden cabinet with a thermos of coffee on the top, just held down with bungees. And I found myself down there with Dick Scobie. And Scobie and I got to know each other pretty well by that time. And right behind this cabinet was a Frisbee. Well, you can't present 20 minutes of inactivity at 45,000 plus feet with a completely empty 747 to two guys with a Frisbee between. And we started flying that Frisbee backwards and forwards. And when we got down, I can say this now because God bless him, Dick's no longer with us, but when we got down, I suggested to him that at 45,300 feet, we ought to be claiming from the Guinness Book of World Records the altitude record for Frisbee flying. And he said, I think that might be misinterpreted as misappropriation of government funds. Of course, at the time, we didn't know he was going for astronauts. He wanted to really keep his record clean. That was kind of a funny one.
Have any others? Well, if not, there's one more.
Go ahead.
He just thought you were going to leave, but we have one more.
There's a question for the propulsion engineer. Was Boeing completely committed to the Pratt & Whitney engine, or was there a backup plan for a multi-engine plan like a B-52?
Barry, that could be a yes or no answer.
That's a very good question. At the beginning of the program, no, there was no alternative because Rolls-Royce had gone off to work the L-1011 with the LV-211. GE had gone off to work the DC-10 with the CF-6, and we had the Pratt & Whitney engine only. But I will say that downstream of the basic JT9D, once 3 years was up and we got the 7 series engines in service, we decided to offer General Electric engines and ultimately Rolls-Royce engines on the same airplane. And that, I think, generated a tremendous amount of intercompany competition, which in the long term paid off with reliability of the engines. All three of them came up. And now you compare the kind of in-flight shutdown rate we had when Jim was flying, having to shut 10 down in a year. Now, if you have to shut one down in 5 years, you're probably unique at this point. So it generated a tremendous amount of competition to put the other engines on. And that, I think, ultimately benefited the effort to get to 2-man crew from 3-man crew, and also for extended range operations on all of the airplanes, particularly the twins. Okay?
Could you speak a minute about miles per passenger, miles per gallon per passenger?
That's a tough one. I can't remember, to be honest. Miles per gallon, I think per gallon. Can you remember, Mike? I can't.
Oh, me?
I've been out of it too long.
The revenue passenger miles for
Jack, can you
specific
remember that?
fuel consumption.
Typical numbers? I can't.
It would be a specific fuel consumption for your weight, basically. Pounds per mile.
Specific fuel consumption was down around what? 0.2 pounds per hour per pound of thrust, something like that, for those high bypass ratio engines at altitude. But what that translated to in terms of gallons or gallons per mile per passenger, I can't remember, to be honest with you.
Anything else? Well, folks, what I'd like to do is thank all of you for coming out. The panelists will be available out in the lobby if you'd like to have further discussion with them or get other questions answered. And we will see you out there. They'll be out there in about 5 minutes or so. But I'd like to thank Mike Lombardi, Barry, Captain Ann with an E. Simpson,